that. All right, so for today we're going to talk about Solomon's temple, and I want to go over things that we have here on our paper. These chapters, there's a lot of information, there's a lot of details. Just like in the giving of the tabernacle, there's a lot of very specific details here as we talk about Solomon's temple. Of course, the Temple of Solomon is the crowning achievement of Solomon's kingship in Israel. More time is spent talking about Solomon's temple here than any other subject in Solomon's life. It certainly takes the center stage when you talk about Solomon's reign and rule. So we're going to talk about the temple, kind of give an overview, and then I have a video that we're going to watch that will give a visual aspect to the things that we will talk about here. But we'll kind of go over our outline quickly, won't get bogged down in a lot of the details because a lot of that you will see when we look at the video today. So again, this is a lengthy account here covering these chapters of very detailed, intricate details about the tabernacle, the gathering of supplies that we saw last week. The king of Tyre was a friend of King David, and he helped Solomon out sending the wood that was needed to build the temple. The temple was built out of stone and wood, and then it was all the interior was overlaid with gold. So there was many costly materials, a vast undertaking. The amount of material, the amount of labor that it took, 7 years it took building the temple, so it was not an easy project, but it was a very specific project. So in chapter 5, we saw the approval for the building. We saw the beginning of gathering the materials together. Then in 6 and 7, we'll see the building of the temple, the exterior, the interior. We see Solomon's palace being built in chapter 7, the furnishings being built in chapter 7, and then the dedication in chapter 8. And at the dedication, God's presence fills the temple and the whole house. What you see here in the beginning of our paper, the 6 bullet points here, is a sixfold structure attested in Mesopotamia. The building of Solomon's temple and the account of it is not unlike other accounts that we have of divine temples back in the ancient days. For we see the breakdown here of the divine approval for the building, the preparations for the building, the description of the work, and the complete building of the temple, the dedication celebrations, the dedication prayers, and then at the end of it comes divine promises, which include blessings and curses, which echo back to Deuteronomy. For centering in the temple is still God's covenant. You know, the temple is not operating apart from the covenant. So just as in the giving of the old covenant, there were blessings and curses, the giving of the tabernacle, there were blessings and curses. It was all dependent upon how Israel kept the covenant. If they kept the covenant, they were ensured of blessings. If they did not keep the covenant, then curses would come upon them. So just as back in Deuteronomy and Numbers, to some extent, Exodus, we have the blessings and curses. So even though this is God's temple, even though God's presence was going to fill it, this is a place where God would put His name, where His presence would reside. It all hinged upon the Israelites' faithfulness to the covenant. For just as God blessed them with the temple, if they ended up breaking the covenant, God could destroy the same temple that was built here, which, spoiler alert, that happened. So we see here kind of the outline of what goes on here in the temple. So that outline will help you as you're reading. When we talk about the exterior of the temple, we find the exterior in chapter 6 here of the book of 1 Kings. And if you notice in 1 Kings chapter 6 verse 1, we find here, if you want to open your scriptures in chapter 6 verse 1, chapter 6 verse 1 says, "In the 400 480th year after the Israelites came out of Egypt. So he begins here with a very significant statement. And it's a statement about coming out of Egypt. So this is kind of wrapping up this journey all the way in Egypt. For when God's people were in Egypt, they were enslaved in Egypt, and God delivered them out of Egyptian bondage. And they ended up coming to Mount Sinai in the wilderness, where they were given the law. And then they ended up wandering in the wilderness for 40 years. Then Moses died, Moses' generation died, and they ended up crossing the Jordan under Joshua's leadership into the Promised Land. But if you remember, when they entered the Promised Land, they operated in different territories that were given to the different tribes. So they were all scattered, not really under a unified leadership in the book of Judges. So God would raise up judges in certain areas of the land to defeat the enemies that were coming. So they were a nation, but they were not wholly unified. That didn't come until later. So after the period of the judges, we saw that now God is going to give them a king. They ask for a king, and God gives them a king. And it's really under David, where David establishes Jerusalem as the capital. He pitches the tent of David with the Ark of the Covenant there, and gives Israel a central place of leadership, a central place of worship, a central place of rulership. The kingdom expands under David, expands even more under Solomon. And now with Solomon building the temple, we move from temporary to permanent. We move from, a scattered tribes to a unified nation for many different places of worship. For each place had kind of their own high places of worship where they would sacrifice, and the temple was in one place, and they had places of sacrifice, and the priests were spread out. Now they have one central place of worship. So this really brings to fulfillment and brings to an end this whole journey since coming out of Egypt. And that's why the writer here in chapter 6 begins with this little note: in the 480th year after the Israelites came out of Egypt, now we finally begin to build God a permanent dwelling place. Over 480 years, almost double the time America has been a nation. Take our time, 200 plus years, and almost double that. And that's the time Israel journeyed from Egypt through the wilderness, settling in the Promised Land until finally they get a capital city. Finally, they're a unified nation. Finally, they're growing and prospering in the way that has been promised up until this time. So it's been a long time coming. So 480 years after they come out of Egypt, in the 4th year of Solomon's reign, he begins to build the temple. And so he starts here in chapter 6, gives the exterior through verse 14. It gives the exterior of the temple. The dimensions of the temple are given, roughly convert to 90 feet in length, 30 feet wide, and 45 feet high. So almost double that of the tabernacle. Chapter 6 describes the parts of the temple. There are 3 kind of major parts here of the temple. There is the temple building itself, where the inner court and where the holy place and most holy place is, the inner sanctuaries. Then you have the portico, which is like the front porch of the temple. And then there was, surrounding the building, a structure that contained side rooms and chambers. So if you look at the diagram here, the kind of tall portion in the middle is the inner court, the inner sanctuary. The front of that, where the pillars are, or the columns are, that's called the portico, that's the porch. And then the 3-story outer portion is where the priestly chambers were. So if you remember, they just had a tent in the tabernacle. It was a little tent with the most holy place and the holy place. So this is expanded. It's bigger, it's wider, it's longer, it's taller. It's got the front portico, and then it's got the surrounding rooms or the chambers for the priest, the 3 stories high. And the house was built out of stone, with the outer walls being stone. Interesting, there was no hammer, no axe, no tool of iron heard in the house itself while the building process went on. All of the stones were already carved to perfection in a quarry before they were transported to Jerusalem. The significance is that the stones were cut so perfectly before coming to the temple building that no further work needed to be done. An iron tool would violate a holy structure, and additionally, the relative quiet construction would be consistent with the sacredness of the building. So that shows you the exterior of the building and the 3 parts to the exterior. When we come to the interior, we have a very impressive interior. The interior walls of the holy place were made of cedar and cypress boards, carved in the shapes of gourds and open flowers, palm trees as well. All of the interior was made of cedar, so no stone was seen on the inside. So the exterior were stones. The interior was made of cedar wood with shapes carved and fashioned into it. Then that cedar wood was overlaid with pure gold. So the whole interior, as you can see in the picture there, was overlaid with pure gold from floor to ceiling, and even the floors itself, the beams in the ceiling, everything was pure gold in the inner sanctuary. And if you notice in the picture down there, you have what would be the holy place, which is where that priest is standing there. The holy place, they would have the menorahs, where there was one menorah candlestick in the tabernacle. There were 10 candlesticks here in the temple. And you see the table of showbread and the altar of incense that the priest is standing between there. So that was one room. Then kind of that upper room was the most holy place. So you see the steps leading up to the most holy place, and that is sectioned off there. But you see that there is the Ark of the Covenant, but on either side of the Ark of the Covenant are these 2 cherubim, these 2 cherubs that were also fashioned and overlaid with the gold, and they were huge. They fill up almost the whole room. The wings would touch the outer portions of the walls, and the wings would be touching each other, and the Ark of the Covenant would be between. So these 2 huge cherubim, which cherubim at that time were kind of composite creatures, as you see, part bull, part lion, part eagle, part human, signified power, strength, speed, understanding, all of the characteristics, all the great characteristics of humans and animals was summed up in the cherubim. In Egyptian temples, and cherubims were very common in ancient days, where thrones where kings would sit. We see it in Egyptian temples. We see it in other Mesopotamian temples, Canaanite thrones. So it was very common to have this type of imagery symbolizing strength and wisdom and speed. And so God's temple, where God's throne was, would be marked by these cherubim on either side. Now there were cherubim on top of the Ark of the Covenant, and so there were cherubim on top of the Ark of the Covenant, and then these huge cherubim in the most holy place. And of course everything was laid with gold, with cherubim and flowers and palm trees carved into the walls. So you can see all of those there. So it was a magnificent sight to behold. I mean, can you imagine walking into the doors of this holy place, and nothing but gold lit up by the fire of these 10 menorahs. A beautiful sight that we see here. And of course, that is all of this. The buildings of the temple took 7 years to complete. So all of those details are found there in chapter 6. When we come to chapter 7, chapter 7 begins with the account of Solomon's palace complex. We won't spend a lot of time going in there, but you can read through that in chapter 7, verses 1 through 12. The interesting thing about Solomon's complex is that it is significantly larger than the temple. So as he builds God a house, Solomon builds a bigger house, and it takes a longer time to build than the temple itself. Which ultimately, and it's not really pointed to here in chapter 7, but what Solomon ultimately does is begins to take pride in his own wisdom, his own money, his own accomplishments, and thus we'll see next week Solomon's downfall. So you can almost kind of see that here with Solomon building a bigger palace, which isn't in the grand scheme of things a bigger things because the temple was more restrictive than Solomon's own palace. But you find that account in the first 12 verses of Solomon's palace. Then in chapter 7, what you have here is the furnishings of the temple. One thing that Solomon does is he gets a man named Huram from Tyre, who is a skilled craftsman. It's said he's filled with knowledge, wisdom, and understanding to do all kinds of bronze work. So as we see, the interior of the holy place is made of gold. The exterior furnishings are made of bronze. And so he gets this man who is skilled with all wisdom, knowledge, and understanding in all kind of bronze works, and he does the exterior working of bronze. And there were many things made of bronze. One thing made of bronze were the 2 pillars at the entrance of the portico, the porch. Then there was the laver, which is referred to here as the sea, for it is huge, way bigger than the laver that was in the tabernacle. And then he made 12 bulls that the sea stood upon, and you see that in the picture there. You see the big bronze sea there with the 12 bulls. Then he makes 10 movable stands of bronze to carry 10 bronze basins for the priest. He also makes the bronze altar that you see there where the priest is sacrificing with the fire coming off of the altar. So you can see a complete list of his work in chapter 7, 40 through 45. And then it lists all the furniture of the temple at the end of chapter 7, which includes the golden altar, the golden table of showbread, the golden lampstands that were in the inner place. So in the picture there you can see the exterior and the interior of the tabernacle, the bronze furnishings made by Huram of Tyre, and then the gold furniture on the interior of the tabernacle. So it's in the temple. So it's the tabernacle on steroids here. I mean, it is bigger and better and more glorious. It's really a place fit for Yahweh and for a king. So huge, magnificent building of the temple. So what I want to do at this time, having to quickly gone over all that, I want to show this video. It's about 10 minutes, but I want to watch this video, and then we will go into chapter 8, and then maybe go into some of that here. But let's.
Solomon's temple stood in Jerusalem for almost 400 years. It was the crown jewel of Jerusalem and the center of worship to the Lord. Almost half of the Old Testament writings took place during the time when Solomon's temple was still standing. Understanding the significance of its location, history, and design can greatly add to one's reverence for one of the most holy places in the world. The city of Jerusalem is located in an area of 3 major valleys: the Hinnom, the Central or Tyropoeon, and the Kidron Valley. The mountain range between the Central and Kidron Valley is called Mount Moriah. The peak of the mountain is a large protruding flat rock, which is now located under the dome of the rock. According to Genesis 22:2, Abraham was commanded to sacrifice Isaac in the region of Moriah, connecting the Temple Mount with this significant event. At the time of King David, the area of Jerusalem was controlled by the Jebusites, the city only occupying the southern part of the central ridge. When David captured the city in about 1000 BC, he made Jerusalem his capital. David then moved the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem and began preparations for building a permanent structure to replace the portable tabernacle of Moses that had been used for over 400 years. With the ancient city of Jerusalem being fairly small, David purchased the threshing floor of Araunah the Jebusite so he could expand the size of the city. Being higher than the city of David, the hilltop would make a beautiful place to build the temple of the Lord. Under the reign of David's son, King Solomon, the temple construction began. After 7 years of construction in about 960 BC, Solomon finished building the temple, most likely built over this same protruding rock of Mount Moriah. Solomon also built himself a new palace just south of the temple and expanded the walls of the city up towards the peak of Mount Moriah. The Temple of Solomon was modeled after the Tabernacle of Moses. Because of the many similarities between the tabernacle and the Garden of Eden, many scholars believe that the Garden of Eden was the prototype for the tabernacle, and thus later temples. According to Jewish tradition, Eden was located on a hill, with the tree of life and the tree of knowledge of good and evil at the center of the hill. The Bible teaches that when Adam and Eve transgressed and partook of the forbidden fruit, they were cast out towards the east. Cherubim and a flaming sword were then placed at the east entrance to prevent them from partaking of the tree of life, as they would then live forever in their sin. In order to return back into the presence of God, Israel had to symbolically retrace the steps of Adam and Eve, passing the cherubim and re-entering the garden in a westward direction. The tabernacle was set up in the same east-to-west progression, seeming to replicate the Garden of Eden. The tabernacle was divided into 3 main courts: the outer court, the holy place, and the Holy of Holies. The outer court represented the fallen world, while the inner courts represented a more sacred and holier way of life. In essence, as the priest, who represented all of Israel, progressed through the tabernacle, or temple, he left the world to enter a more holy state, and then was enabled to re-enter the presence of the Lord, passing the angels, or cherubim who were embroidered on the veil. Solomon's temple replicated this same 3-level progression, doubling the floor plan size of the tabernacle sanctuary for the temple structure. As one approached the Temple of Solomon, the first thing noticed was the brazen altar of sacrifice. The altar was 20 cubits long and wide and 10 cubits high, a cubit being the length from the elbow to the tip of the longest finger, or about 1.5 feet. On the 4 corners of the altar were 4 horns often representing power. This is where the sacrificial animals were burned, representing the future sacrifice of the Savior Jesus Christ. On the southeast side of the temple was the molten or brazen sea, which rested on the backs of 12 oxen, 3 pointing in each of the cardinal directions. In ancient times, oxen represented strength, and the number 12 often represented the 12 tribes of Israel. Water from the larger brazen sea was poured into 10 bronze water basins on both sides of the temple, which could then be wheeled around the outer court for various washing and cleansing rituals by the priests. Around the south, west, and north sides of the temple were 3 floors of chambers or storage rooms. The inside wall of the chambers was stepped so as to create a ledge where the timbers of the floors could rest. The storage rooms were accessed by a door on the south side of the temple, with wooden ladders going up into each of the floors. At the front of the temple were 2 large bronze pillars that flanked the porch. The pillar on the left was named Boaz, and the pillar on the right was named Yakin. The tops were decorated with lily flower petals and pomegranates. Pomegranates were a sign of prosperity and posterity because of their many seeds, and were also found on the bottom hem of the clothing of the high priest. The main temple doors were made of two large bifolding doors covered in gold with cherubim, palm trees, and open flowers. The Bible describes the doorframe as being a fourth part of the wall, which most scholars believe means that the door had four stepped frames. The interior doorway of the Holy of Holies was similar, except having 5 frames instead of 4. The priests who represented Israel were the only ones allowed into the inner temple. This means that Israel only could enter through being represented by the priests. Once you entered the main doors, you entered the holy place, a large room 40 cubits long, 20 cubits wide, and 30 cubits tall. The room was overlaid with gold and decorated with cherubim, palm trees, and open flowers, possibly alluding to the beauty of the Garden of Eden. The room was lit by 10 large menorahs, 5 on each side of the room, that were constantly burning, and narrow windows on each side of the top of the room. On the right side of the room was located the table of showbread, which had 12 large flat pita-like loaves. The priests ate and then replaced the showbread every Sabbath, similar to our weekly partaking of the communion or sacramental bread. Breaking bread and sharing a meal with someone in ancient times represented that you were at peace with them and was a sign of brotherhood, love, and forgiveness. Directly in front of the Holy of Holies was the altar of incense. The altar was similar to the altar of sacrifice in that it had a square footprint and also had 4 horns, 1 on each of the corners. However, on the altar of sacrifice was burned the flesh of animals, while upon the altar of incense burned a sweet combination of incenses. The incense burning before the veil of the temple represented the prayers of the saints ascending to God before the veil, a reminder that before we can enter God's presence, our lives, prayers, and actions must become a sweet savor unto the Lord. Only the high priest was able to enter the Holy of Holies, and only on 1 day a year, the Day of Atonement. Before entering, the high priest passed through a beautifully embroidered veil woven from purple, red, blue, and white threads. The colors were the same as used in the ephod and breastplate of the clothing of the high priest, minus the gold thread. Embroidered on the veil were cherubim, who symbolically guarded the dwelling place of God. As the high priest passed through the veil, he had to pass these angels, who, like in the Garden of Eden, guarded the way back to the presence of the Lord. Upon entering the Holy of Holies, you would find that the room is in the shape of a perfect cube, being 20 cubits wide, long, and tall. The walls were likewise overlaid with gold and decorated with cherubim, palm trees, and open flowers. 2 large cherubim flanked the Ark of the Covenant, which was in the center of the room, with their wings stretching from one side of the room to the other. This room is where the presence of the Lord would dwell, and represented the final goal and destiny of all Israel. Solomon's temple was not only a landmark for the city of Jerusalem, but more importantly, the dwelling place of the Lord. The layout represented Israel's progression back into God's presence and was designed to teach Israel that it was only through the infinite sacrifice of the sinless Messiah that they could once again enjoy the presence of the Lord. A sacrifice that would be performed on a cross only a short distance from this holy mountain.
So that gives you a good overview of what this temple was. It was, a expansion of what was previously given in the tabernacle of Moses, but double the size, much more beautiful, obviously way much more permanent, the centerpiece of all of Jerusalem. And as you saw in the diagram there, it was at the highest peak of the mountains in Jerusalem. So from all Jerusalem, historians say that you could look up and see the peak and the top of the temple from the city. So it was definitely the centerpiece of Jerusalem, the centerpiece of Solomon's reign and the centerpiece of all of Israel because it's where God's presence was. Which brings us to chapter 8. And after the building of the temple, we see in chapter 8 the dedication of the temple. The first thing that you'll find in chapter 8 of 1 Kings is that King Solomon has the Ark of the Covenant brought to the temple. So if you notice in chapter 8 and verse number 1, 1 Kings 8:1, Then King Solomon summoned into his presence at Jerusalem the elders of Israel, all the heads of the tribes, and the chiefs of the Israelite families, to bring the ark of the Lord's covenant from Zion, the city of David. All the Israelites came together to King Solomon at the time of the festival in the month of Ethanim in the 7th month. When all the elders of Israel had arrived, the priests took the ark. They brought up the ark of the Lord to the tent of the meeting, and all the sacred furnishings in it. The priests and the Levites carried them up, and King Solomon and the entire assembly of Israel that had gathered about him were before the ark, sacrificing so many sheep and cattle that they could not be recorded or counted. The priests then brought the ark of the Lord's covenant into its place in the inner sanctuary of the temple, the most holy place, and put it beneath the wings of the cherubim. The cherubim spread their wings over the place of the ark and overshadowed the ark and its carrying poles. These poles were so long that their ends could be seen from the holy place in front of the inner sanctuary, but not from the outside of the holy place that are still there today. There was nothing in the ark except the 2 stone tablets that Moses had placed in it at Horeb, where the Lord made a covenant with the Israelites after they came out of Egypt. Then when the priests withdrew from the holy place, this is the crowning moment. When the priests withdrew from the holy place, the cloud filled the temple of the Lord. And the priests could not perform their service because of the cloud, for the glory of the Lord filled his temple. And man, what probably a moment that was to behold. We saw the presence of God initially meeting Israel at Mount Sinai in the book of Exodus, where the mountain was filled with smoke and lightnings and thunderings and fearfulness. That's where we first saw the presence of the Lord. And then the tabernacle was given. And we saw the presence of the Lord in the tabernacle as a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. And now we see the presence of the Lord, this cloud of glory, fill the whole temple. So much so that the priests could not perform their service. And this has to be a great sentence ending this: for the glory of the Lord filled his temple. And now God's presence has a permanent dwelling place among his people. Verse 12 says, Then Solomon said, The Lord has said that he would dwell in a dark cloud. I have indeed built a magnificent temple for you, a place for you to dwell forever. And while the whole assembly of Israel was standing there, the king turned around and blessed them. And so he turns around and he blesses the people. And then in verse 22, Solomon stood before the altar of the Lord in front of the whole assembly, spread out his hands and said, and this is his prayer of dedication. So what we have here, and we won't go through and read all of both of those. You can go and read those. But most of chapter 8 consists of the prayer of dedication. We have the prayer of the people and the prayer of dedication to the Lord. If you notice on our paper, the second paragraph, when it says most of chapter 8, the temple is now a visible symbol of Yahweh's presence. What happens here is that he praises Yahweh's faithfulness. The completed temple testifies to God's faithfulness. But, however, the temple cannot contain all of God's presence. It does not place him under obligation to bless his people. So Solomon asks in verse 30, Hear the plea of your servant and of your people Israel when they pray towards this place. O hear in heaven your dwelling place, heed and forgive. Solomon's prayer frequently echoes Deuteronomy 28 through 30 and follows the pattern of those chapters in which sin finally leads to exile, but the people are restored when they repent. So the prayer is echoing things that we've already seen back in Deuteronomy. The verses detailing or dealing with exile do not explicitly mention a return to the land, speaking merely of Yahweh granting Israel in exile compassion in the sight of their captors. So even in Solomon's prayer, it's kind of pointing toward things aren't always going to be great. Because as we said, everything is still up to Israel. Why? Because they're under the old covenant. Under the old covenant, it was still dependent upon them. We'll do a mini gospel circle right here. Even in the old covenant, as magnificent as the building was, as the best materials that you could find in the ancient world, as most expensive building that you could build, overlaid with gold and its magnificence and beauty, and as great as God's presence was filling the place here in chapter 8, everything was still dependent upon Israel. Everything was still dependent upon their obedience. Everything was still dependent upon their dedication and their faithfulness. Why? Because they were still under the if-then covenant. If you keep the law, then God will bless you. If you break it, then you will be cursed. So it was still not enough. It was still not enough. For that, this beautiful temple ends up falling because the people would be unfaithful to the covenant. But then you come over to a new covenant. Then you come over to God building a new temple based upon not a if-then covenant, but a since-therefore covenant. Not based upon sacrifices. If you notice when we read here that they offered so many sacrifices, they couldn't even record how many sacrifices were offered. And all those sacrifices could not guarantee God's salvation to them forever. But when you come to the new covenant, it didn't take many sacrifices. It didn't take thousands of sacrifices and thousands of bulls. It took one sacrifice to forever seal the covenant that God made with His Son Jesus on Mount Calvary. And so God's presence on the day of Pentecost fills a new temple. That's why Acts chapter 2 is a parallel to this. Because you have, a rushing mighty wind that fills the house where 120 disciples of Jesus Christ were praying and sitting. And the presence of God filled God's new temple in Acts chapter 2. But it didn't fill the building, it filled the people. And now God's people, Jew and Gentile, Ephesians chapter 2 tells us, are built together as a holy temple to the Lord, where God's presence dwells. And it dwells in us. And it's an abiding presence, not a coming and going presence as we see in the Old Testament, but an abiding presence built upon one sacrifice, a finished work. And this kingdom, the kingdom of Messiah, the kingdom of Jesus, will be a kingdom that lasts forever. Not a temporary kingdom, not an insufficient kingdom, but a permanent kingdom. So as we see God's presence filling the temple here, and a beautiful sight, but you go back and read in Ezekiel, and what do you see in Ezekiel? God's presence leaves the temple. And the word Ichabod, this presence of God is departed, is written over the temple. So as beautiful as it is, as magnificent as it is, you and I are more beautiful. You and I are more magnificent. You and I, do you not know, as Paul told the Corinthians, that the Spirit of God lives in you? And we are the dwelling place of God's temple based upon the sacrifice of Jesus Christ. So as beautiful and as magnificent as it was, and it had to be a beautiful sight to walk into and see all the gold, see all the furnishing, no expense spared. It was still dependent upon their faithfulness, upon their obedience. And this temple ended up being destroyed many years later. So, I hate to end on that note, but the good news is that the presence of God in you and I, He really found a permanent dwelling place. Not dependent upon you or I, not dependent upon our dedication, our faithfulness, but dependent upon our faith in the one perfect and final sacrifice. To me, that's good news. This beautiful temple came with conditions. But God's love placed upon us comes with a promise and a guarantee that the Spirit that lives in us will remain forever. So, chapter 9, the Lord appears to Solomon a second time. And again, what does the focus here is on what God requires. Integrity, obedience, and loyalty to the covenant. It's still all about the covenant. And only on the basis of obedience and loyalty to Yahweh will Solomon's line continue to rule Israel, which Solomon's line would not continue to rule Israel. They would be carried off into exile until Jesus comes on the scene. The end of chapter 9, we have some other of Solomon's activities surrounding the building of the temple. In exchange for all of the cedar and juniper wood that the king of Tyre gave him, Solomon gave the king of Tyre 20 towns, which the king was not really impressed with. But it ends with the construction of other towns and ships, as well as Solomon's wife's palace, and then Solomon's use of the Canaanites as forced labor to help build all of this, which chapter 9, we kind of get a sense at the end of chapter 9 that things may be taking a different turn with Solomon. And that's what we'll pick up next week as we look at Solomon's downfall. So as great as everything is now, this is the crowning achievement. This is the crowning achievement of Solomon. And we will begin to see where Solomon goes wrong next week.